Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, Chapter 12, continued. For the next 3 weeks, she was so busy with Elfine that she had no time to worry about the unknown female Starcatters. She spent most of her time with Elfine. She expected at first that someone would interfere and try to stop Elfine and her from going for their morning walk along the top of the downs and from spending the afternoons in Flora's little garden or little green parlor. These habits were innocent, but that was not enough to keep the Starcatters from trying to stop them. Nay, their very innocence was more likely to set the grand, rugged Starcatter machinery in motion. For it is a peculiarity of persons who lead such rich emotional lives, and who, as the saying is, live intensely, and with a wild poetry, and that they read all kinds of meanings into comparatively simple actions, especially the actions of other people who do not live intensely, and with a wild poetry. Thus you may find them weeping passionately on their bed, and be told that you alone are the cause you said that awful thing to them at lunch, because you said that awful thing to them at lunch. Or they wonder why you like going to concerts. There must be more in it than meets the eye, so the cousins usually slipped out for their walks when no one was about. Flora had learned by experience that she must ask permission of the Starcatters if she wanted to go down into Beershorn, or if, as she did a week or so after her arrival, she wanted to buy a pot of apricot jam for tea. On this occasion she had found Judith lying face downwards in the furrows of Ticklepenny's corner, weeping. In reply to her question, Judith had said that anybody might do anything they pleased so long as she was left alone with her sorrow. Flora took this generous statement to mean that she might pay for the jam. And so she did, but on the whole she spent little money at Cold Comfort, and so she had nearly £80 to spend on Elfine. She decided that they would go up to London together the day before the ball and buy her gown and get her hair cut correctly. She was pleased to be spending £80 on Elfine. If she succeeded in making Dick Hawkmonitor propose to Elfine, it would be a successful geste in the face of the Starcatters. It would be a triumph of the higher common sense over Aunt Ada Doom. It would be a victory for Flora's philosophy of life over the subconscious life philosophy of the Starcatters. It would be like a splendid deer stepping haughtily across a plowed field. For 3 weeks she forced Elfine as a gardener skillfully forces a flower in a hothouse. Her task was difficult, but might have been much more so, for Elfine's peculiarities of dress, outlook, and behavior were due only to her own youthful tastes. They had not been ground into her for years by older people. She was ready to shed them if something better was shown to her. Also, she was only 17 years old, and docile when Flora planned away all the St. Francis cum Barbola work crust. She found beneath it an honest child, capable of loving calmly, yet deeply, friendly and sweet-tempered, and fond of pretty things. "Have you always admired St. Francis?" asked Flora as they sat one rainy afternoon in the little green parlor toward the end of the first week. "I mean, who told you about him, and who taught you to wear those shocking clothes?" "I wanted to be like Miss Ashford. She keeps the bluebird's cage down in Howling for a month or two. She kept the bluebird's cage in Howling for a month or two last summer. I went in there to tea once or twice. She was very kind to me. She used to have lovely clothes. That is, they weren't what you would call lovely, but I used to like them. She had a smock embroidered with hollyhocks," said Flora resignedly, "and I'll bet she wore her hair in shells round her ears, and a pendant made of hammered silver and a bit of blue enamel in the middle. Did she try to grow herbs? How did you know?" "Never mind. I do know. And she talked to you about Brother Wind and Sister Sun and the wind on the hearth, didn't she?" "Yes, she had a picture of St. Francis feeding the birds. It was lovely." "And did you want to be like her, Elfine?" "Oh, yes. She never tried to make me like her, of course, but I did want to be. I used to copy her clothes." "Yes, well, never mind that now. Go on with your reading." And Elfine obediently resumed her reading aloud of Our Lives from Day to Day from an April number of Vogue. When she had finished, Flora took her page by page through a copy of Chiffons, which was devoted to descriptions and sketches of lingerie, Flora pointed out how these graceful petticoats and nightgowns depended upon their pure line and delicate embroidery for their beauty, how all gross romanticism was purged away, or expressed only in a fold or a flute of material. She then showed how the same delicacy might be found in the style of Jane Austen, or a painting by Marie Laurencin. "It is the kind of beauty," said Flora, "that you must learn to look for and admire in everyday life." "I like the nightgowns and persuasion," said Elfie, "but I don't like our lives very much." "Flora, it's all rather in a hurry, isn't it? And wanting to tell you how nice it was. I do not propose that you shall found a life philosophy upon our lives from day to day, Elfine. I merely make you read it because you will have to meet people who do that kind of thing, and you must on no account be all dewy and odd when you do meet them. You can, if you like, secretly despise them. Nor must you talk about Marie Laurencin to people who hunt. They will merely think she is your new mare. No, I tell you of these things in order that you may have some standard within yourself with which secretly to compare the many new facts and people you will meet, and then if you enter a new life." She did not tell Elfine of the higher common sense, but quoted one or two of the Pensies to her from time to time, and resolved to give her H.B. Mainwaring's excellent translation of the higher common sense as a wedding present. Elfine progressed. Her charming nature and Flora's wise advice met and mingled naturally. Only over poetry was there a little struggle. Flora warned Elfine that she must write no more poetry if she wanted to marry into the country. "I thought poetry was enough," said Elfine wistfully. I thought poetry was so beautiful that if you met someone you loved and you told them you wrote poetry, that would be enough to make them fall in love too." "On the contrary," said Flora. "Firstly, most young men are alarmed on hearing that a young woman writes poetry. Combined with an ill-groomed head of hair and an eccentric style of dress, such an admission is almost fatal." "I shall write it secretly and publish it when I am 50, said Elfine rebelliously. Flora coldly raised her eyebrows and decided that she would return to the attack when Elfine had had her hair cut and seen her beautiful new dress. They entered upon the third week in hopeful spirits. At first, Elfine had been bewildered and unhappy in the new worlds into which Flora led her, but as she grew at home in them and became fond of Flora, she was happy and bloomed like a rose peony. She fed upon hope, and even Flora's confident spirit faltered before the thought of what a weltering ruin, what a desert must ensue if those hopes were never achieved. But they must be achieved. Flora wrote as much as her ally, Claude Hart-Harris. She had chosen him rather than Charles as her escort to the Hawk Monitor's ball, because she felt that she would need all her powers of concentration to see herself and Elfine safely through the evening, and if Charles came to partner her, she would be conscious of a certain interest in their own personal relationship, a current of unsaid speeches which would distract her feelings and perhaps confuse a little of her thoughts. Claude had written to say that she might expect the invitation on April 19th or so she came down to breakfast in the kitchen on the morning of the 19th with a pleasant sensation of excitement and anticipation. It was 8:30. Mrs. Beadle had finished sweeping the floor and was shaking the mat out in the yard in the sunshine. It always surprised Flora to see the sun shining into the yard at Cold Comfort. She had a feeling that the rays ought to be short-circuited just outside the wall by the atmosphere of the farmhouse. Nice morning, screamed Mrs. Beadle, adding that we could do with a bit of it. Flora smilingly agreed and went across to the cupboard to take down her own little green teapot, a present from Mrs. Smiling, and a tin of China tea. She glanced out into the yard and was pleased to see that none of the male starcatters were about. Elfine was out on a walk. Judith was probably lying desperately across her bed, looking with leaden eyes at the ceiling across from the first flies of the year. Judith was probably lying desperately across her bed, looking with leaden eyes at the ceiling across which the first flies of the year were beginning monotonously to circle and crawl. The bull suddenly bellowed in his thick, dark red note. Flora paused with the teapot in her hand and looked thoughtfully out across the yard toward the shed. "Mrs. Beetle," she said firmly, "the bull ought to be let out. Could you help me do it? Are you afraid of bulls?" "Yes," said Mrs. Beetle. "I'm afraid of bulls, and you don't let him out, miss. Not if I stand here till midnight, in all respect, Miss Post, though you was to kill me for it." "We could guide him toward the gate with a bullfork, or whatever it's called," suggested Flora, glancing at the implement which lay across two hooks on the side of the shed. "No, miss," said Mrs. Beetle. "Well, I shall open the gate and try to drive him through it," said Flora, who was utterly terrified of bulls, and cows too, for that matter. "You must wave your apron at him, Mrs. Beetle, and shout." "Yes, miss, I'll go up to your bedroom window," said Mrs. Beetle, "and shout at him from there. The sound'll carry better." She nipped away like lightning before Flora could stop her. A few seconds later, Flora heard her shouting shrilly from the window, "Go on, Miss Post, I'm here." Flora was now rather dismayed. The situation seemed to have developed much more quickly than she had thought it would. She was extremely afraid. She stood there, idly waving the teapot and trying to remember all she had ever read about the habits of bulls. They ran at red. Well, they would not run at her. She was all in green. They were savage, especially in spring. It was the middle of April, and the trees were in bud. They gored you. Big Business bellowed again. It was a harsh, mournful sound. There were old swamps and rotting horns buried in it. Flora ran across the yard and pushed open the gate leading into the big field facing the farm, fastening it back. Then she took down the bull prong, or whatever it called itself, and standing at a comfortable distance from the shed, maneuvered the catch back and saw the door swing open. Out came Big Business. It was a much less dramatic affair than she had supposed it would be. He stood for a second or two, bewildered by the light, with his big head swaying stupidly. Flora stood quite still. "Eeeeee! Go on, you old brute!" shrieked Mrs. Beetle. The bull lumbered off across the yard, still with his head down toward the gate. Flora followed cautiously, holding the bull prong. Mrs. Beetle screamed to her, for the dear's sake, to be careful. Once Big Business half turned toward her, and she made a determined movement with the prong. Then, to her relief, he went through the gate into the grassy field, and she swung it too and shut it before he had time to turn around. "There," said Mrs. Beetle, reappearing in the kitchen with the speed of a newspaper proprietor explaining his candidate's failure at a by-election. "I told you so." Flora replaced the bull prong and went back into the kitchen to make her breakfast. It was 9 o'clock. The postman should arrive any minute now. So she sat down to her breakfast in a position that gave her, through the kitchen window, a view of the path leading up to the farm, for she did not want any one of the Starkatters to get the letters from the postman before she had seen whether the invitation to the Hawk Monitor ball was among them. But to her dismay, just as the figure of the postman appeared at the point of the path where it curved over the hill toward the farmhouse, it was joined by another figure. Flora craned her eyes above her cup to see who it might be. It was somebody who had hung about with a good many dead rabbits and pheasants in one way and another, so that his features were obscured from view. He stopped, said something to the postman, and Flora saw something white pass from hand to hand. The rabbit-festooned Starkatter, whoever he might be, had forestalled her. She bit crossly into a piece of toast and continued to observe the approaching figure. He soon came close enough for her to see that it was Irk. She was much disconcerted. It could not have been worse. Turns you up, don't it? Today's dinner come in angering round somewhere's neck like that," observed Mrs. Beetle, who was loading a tray with food to take up to Mrs. Doom. "Tomorrow's too, for all I know, and the days after. Give me cold storage any day." Irk opened the door of the kitchen and came slowly into the room. He had been shooting rabbits. His narrow nostrils were slightly distended to intake the blood odor from the 17 which hung round his neck. Their cold fur brushed his hands lightly and imploringly, like little pleas for mercy, and his buttocks were softly brushed by the dragged tail feathers of 5 pheasants, which hung from the pheasant belt encircling his waist. He felt the weight of the 25 dead animals he bore, for there was a shrew or two in his breast pocket, pulling him down, like heavy, dark-blooded roots into the dumb soil. He was drowsy with killing, in the mood of a lion lying on a hippopotamus with its mouth full. He held the letters in front of him, looking down at them with a sleepy stare. Flora saw, with a start of indignation, that his thumb had left a red mark upon an envelope addressed in Charlie's neat hand. This was quite intolerable. She rose quickly to her feet, holding out her hand. "My letters, please," she said crisply. Irk pushed them across the table to her, but he kept one in his hand, turning it over curiously to look at a crest upon the back of the envelope. "Oh, Lord," thought Flora. I think that one is for me too," she said. Irk did not answer. He looked up at her, then down at the letter, then across at Flora again. When his voice came, it was a throaty snarl. "Who's writing to you? From how, chicka?" "Mary Queen of Scots, thanks," said Flora, with deplorable pertness, and twitched it out of his hand. She slipped it into the pocket of her coat and sat down to finish her breakfast, but the low, throaty snarl cut once more across the silence. "You're smart, aren't you? Don't think I don't know what's going on with books from London and all that rot. Now you listen to me. She's mine, I tell you. Mine. She's my woman, same as a hen belongs to a cock. And no one don't have her except me, you see. She were promised to me the day she were born. By her grandmother, I put a cross in a watervale's blood on her feeding bottle when she was an hour old to mark her for mine, and held her up so she might see it and know she was mine. And every year since then, on her birthday, I've taken her up to Ticklepenny's Corner, and we've hung over the old well until you see a watervale. And I've said to her, remember? And all she would say was, what, Cousin Irk? But she knows all right, she knows. When watervales mate under the May trees this summer, I'll make her mine. Dick Hawk Monitor. What's he? A bit of a boy, playing at horses in a red coat, like his daddy afore him. Many a time I've lay and laughed at 'em, fools. Me and the watervales, we can afford to wait for what we want. So you heed what I say, miss. Elfin's mine. I don't mind her being a bit above me." Here his voice thickened in a manner which caused Mrs. Beadle to make a sound resembling tss, "'cause a man likes his piece to be a bit dainty, but she's mine." "We heard," said Flora. "You said it before." "And God help the man or woman who tries to take it from me. Me and the watervales, we'll get her back." "Are those watervales round your neck?" asked Flora interestedly. "I've never seen any before. What a lot of them all at once." He turned from her with a peculiar stooping, stealthy, swooping movement, and padded out of the kitchen. "Well, I never," said Mrs. Beadle loudly. "There's a nasty temper for you." Flora placidly agreed that it was, but she made up her mind that Elfie must be taken up to town that very day instead of tomorrow as she had planned. She had meant to take Elfie up on the day before the ball, but there was no time to be lost. If Irk suspected that there was going to be a ball, he would probably try to stop them. They must be sure of the dress, and of Elfine's shorn head, whatever happened. They must go at once. She rose, leaving her breakfast unfinished, and hurried upstairs to Elfine's room. She found Elfine just returned from her walk. Flora quickly told her of the change in their plans and left her to get ready while she hurried downstairs to try to find Seth and to ask him to drive them down to the station. They could just catch the 10:59 to town. Seth was hanging over the fence round the great field, looking sullenly at Big Business, who was cantering round and round, bellowing. "Someone's let the bull out," said Seth, pointing. "I know, I did, and quite time, too," said Flora. "But never mind that now. Seth, will you drive Elfie and me down to Beershorn to catch the 10:59? Her request was made in a cool, pleasant voice, yet the softly burning, perpetual ruby flame of romance in Seth responded in some tremor of urgency to her tones. Besides, he wanted to go to the Hawk Monitor's dance and see if it was at all like the hunt ball scene in Silver Hooves, the stupendous drama of English country life with the Intro Pan National had made a year or two ago. He had guessed that Flora was taking Elfine up to London to buy her dress. He did not want anything to interfere with the preparation for the ball. He said aye, he would, and lounged away with his curious animal grace to get out the buggy. Adam appeared at the door of the cowshed where he had been milking graceless, pointless, feckless, aimless, and fury. His old body was bent like a thorn against a sharp dazzle of sticky buds bursting from the boughs of chestnut tree, which hung into the yard. Someone's let the bull out, he said. 'Tis terrible. I'm unsoothed over feckless. She am not herself. Who let him out? I did, said Flora, buckling the belt of her coat. And distant shouts came from the back of the farm where Micah and Ezra were busy setting up the hitten piece which supported the bucket above the well. The bull's out. Who let out Big Business? Who let him out? Who let him loose? 'Tis terrible. Flora had been writing on a leaf from her pocket diary, which she now gave to Adam and instructed him to pin on the door of the kitchen where it could be seen by everyone as they came hurrying into the yard. It said, I did, F post. The buggy came out into the yard with Viper in the shafts and Seth holding the reins, just as Elfine, wearing the deplorable blue cape, appeared at the kitchen door. Jump up, my dear, we have no time to waste, cried Flora, mounting the step of the buggy. Who let the bull out? Thundered Reuben, starting from the pig pen where he had been delivering a sow who was experienced enough, heaven knows, to deliver herself, but who enjoyed being fussed over. Flora pointed silently to the note pinned upon the kitchen door. Seth signed to Adam to open the gate to the yard, which Adam did. Who let the bull out? Screamed Judith, putting her head out from an upper window. The question was repeated by Amos, who burst from the chicken run where he had been collecting eggs. Flora hoped they would all see the note and have their curiosity satisfied, or else they would go blaming each other, and when she came home there would be a shocking atmosphere of rouse and uncomfortableness. But now they were off. Seth struck Viper on the flanks, and they shot forward. Flora repressed an inclination to raise her hat and bow from side to side as they passed through the gate. She felt that someone should have shouted loyally, God bless the young squire! And that is the end of chapter 12.